In my last couple videos, I've talked about a couple of things that lend themselves to a position of uncertainty or at least away from the concept of idealism. The first was my analogy about tents. That a tent is a temporary structure by design that has limited use because it's just supposed to bridge the gap between where you are and where you want to be. So it will protect you in your journey until you reach your destination. It will protect you while you work on building a more permanent residence, and that when it's served its purpose, it should be cast aside without great mourning because it's done what it was meant to do, and it wasn't supposed to last forever. And I said that this was a kind of a useful way for Christians to view the problem of all the various ways that the church has failed to remain an eternally consistent, homogeneous thing. Now, you do have certain very, very old strands within the church, such as the Eastern Orthodox, that have, from a certain point, you can conclusively say that they have changed very little from the 3rd and 4th century. If that is exactly what the church was prior to that, is a more debatable topic. But that's a commendable thing. But in many places and many times, there have been other things and disagreements that have caused people to go their separate ways. And sometimes those have lasted for centuries, and sometimes they've lasted for decades, and sometimes they haven't lasted very long at all. And we have to be able to look at that and say it's not necessarily pure tragedy because some good was accomplished through that. And, we can't cry over the temporary vessels that got us from where we started to where we are now. It's all part of the experience. And the other video I talked about recently was in regards to politics, especially how, in my view, Christians ought to ally themselves with cultural forces who are not perfect. We don't agree with them perfectly, and this is to say conservative Christians who care the most about Christianity, it was good and effective when they were able to ally with Republicans who were conservative in many ways. But we must realize where the points of contention are and what the nature of our partnership with those other parties is. And in effect, it goes back to the tent, because when people make a truce on the battlefield, they were meeting in a tent. And the strategic and temporary acts of diplomacy happen not in the capital or in the castle, but they happen on the tent on the battlefield. And then after that, it may be time for the parties to go their separate ways after their goals have been accomplished. And this may be a position that we are nearing, or we're getting to, or at least if we're not getting to a split from politically conservative parties, we may need to be pushing the boundaries of how much we demand that they accept of our ideals, and push back on how much of their ideals they decide to impose on us. And so this kind of brings me to a little bit of the questionable alliance between Jordan Peterson and the Daily Wire, and really not necessarily a criticism of Jordan Peterson, because he does not hold to the Christian worldview in its entirety. In parts, he is definitely an ally of Christians, and there's definitely a lot of agreement between the things that he values highly and what Christians value highly. But he is, in many more ways, perhaps more closely aligned to the Daily Wire in their core ideology than he is allied with the core ideology of the church. And I'm just using this word ideology to mean the beliefs and concepts that are non-negotiable, that they can be perhaps put aside for a time in a strategic partnership, but they can't just be changed, because to change them would be to change the nature of what it means to be a Christian. And I think that in this regard, it is the place now, not necessarily for the Jordan Peterson fan or follower, but for the Christian to consider what our commitment is towards a group like the Daily Wire. And I would say that the way it changes our response to Peterson is that prior to this partnership, the wise Christians saw Peterson as someone outside of our community who was an ally in many ways. He was valuing many of the things that we value, and doing it in a more philosophical way, and really upholding a lot of the more spiritual aspects of Christianity. Whereas at the same time, a company like Daily Wire is an ally of Christianity because they're upholding much of the moral structure that the church believes in, and the way of living that we uphold. But so in a sense, there was a sort of a triangular interaction between that. We have some but not all things in common with Jordan Peterson. We have some but not all things in common with the Daily Wire. And Jordan Peterson and the Daily Wire have some but not all things in common. But in his choice to ally himself with the Daily Wire specifically, it does bolster the things that all three have in common. In other words, there's many things because of that Jordan Peterson affirms, the Daily Wire affirms, and the church affirms. But now the problem is that whereas there was an individual or a smaller line of disagreement between perhaps Jordan Peterson and the church on some issues and the Daily Wire and the church on some issues, now, as they are in some sense still two entities, because Jordan Peterson has he still has his own platform beyond the Daily Wire, where they agree, and in the areas that they agree and disagree with the church, then it may become a point of contention. And I think that one of these areas is the Christian sexual ethic, and especially the aspect of it. I would say all would affirm the part of the Christian ethic that praises fidelity as a virtue, and all would affirm the aspect of the Christian sexual ethic that maybe values a certain level of modesty or appropriateness. But there are some areas where there is a disagreement, because to a large extent, Daily Wire and Jordan Peterson would say that what happens in private is no one's business but the people who are involved. Whereas the Christian would say there is nothing that happens in private, because God is privy to all, things in all places. And therefore, sin that is hidden is no less harmful than the sin that is blatantly exposed. So while they would agree with the church on the appropriateness of discussing certain things with children of a certain age, there are some lines that they do not have a good answer for. And I recently listened to a brief interview that I will try to find and relink with a woman who previously had written for the Daily Wire and was fired by Ben Shapiro because she criticized non-woke aspects of the homosexual community. And in essence, Ben Shapiro's response to her was that he needed to protect his brand. And part of his brand was reinforced by donors who are conservative politically, but are gay, and who embrace that choice as one of their core defining characteristics. And so for them, it's a non-negotiable. And because they had more monetary influence than maybe some conservative Christian donors, which I don't think there actually are any conservative Christians that are really holding up the Daily Wire as a, I think it's a site that a lot of Christians, probably trust more in political information than many of the mainstream news. But I don't think that it's a place that Christians go to as a source of morality. And those who do are those who end up finding themselves more beholden to a conservative political ideology than to a belief in Christianity, which does happen. And I think it's sad to happen. But this woman got fired basically for questioning, the rights of well-behaved, modest, politically conservative gay people to do as they please and have a legal right to do so. And basically, wanting to question the validity of gay marriage. And, based on the recent House vote, it does seem that is a position that conservatives are no longer interested in trying to fight against. They're perfectly willing, for the most part, to accept gay marriage as an institution that is fine to have in a legal society. And, at one point I considered that, you could take all the aspects of the Christian sexual ethic, which, are fidelity, modesty, abstinence until marriage, purity in thought and deeds, not using things like pornography, which is a form of adultery, essentially. Um, you know, and then the way that people act towards their spouse, the sacrificial love that both husbands and wives should show towards each other. And if you took all of those things and you only omitted the concept of one man and one woman, that, perhaps then, you could, and you could forgive people who were willing to accept all of those standards except the one as, a reasonable way to be a Christian and to affirm people who are homosexual but claim to be Christian and want to live a Christian life. But the thing is that oftentimes there's only the one thing that, when we make a caveat for one thing, that is enough to cause all the pain and suffering in the whole world. Because, Adam and Eve in the garden had the liberty to do everything they desired except one thing. And that one thing was the most important thing for them to obey God in, and it was the area that they chose to disobey God in. Now, it's if they had started to do all sorts of other things that were destructive, and for whatever reason, God would not have held them responsible until he decided to show them why it was wrong and correct their behavior. But he gave them one simple thing and said, this is the one thing that I am denying to you, is to eat of this one tree. And, I think that is the perfect vision of the sinful human person. And, we, especially as Christians who are bound by grace, and believe that there is liberty in Christ, we must realize that there are certain things that are not necessarily the same for all individuals, but they are things that come from the Bible, and it's going to be that one thing that is going to be the point of contention in your life between you and God. And I was thinking about this in regards to the story of David and Bathsheba. And when Nathan the prophet comes to him and tells him the parable about the rich man who had all the flocks and steals the one lamb from the poor man, David's outraged, and then Nathan identifies him with that man. And he says, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. So, it's a total act. It's all the things David did. It's not just the killing of Uriah. It's not just the taking of Bathsheba. And there's been a lot of debate about, was it rape? And, to what degree is coercion by a king a form of rape? Because how much power did the other party have? On the other hand, there is also, pretty good evidence that according to those who were following the law of Israel, and Uriah was a Hittite, and his wife was most likely a Gentile as well, not necessarily an Israelite, although Uriah is portrayed as a godly man, but he was a godly Gentile. But for an Israelite woman, it would not be right to be bathing on the rooftop immodestly and in view of the king's palace, and that's something that she certainly would have been aware of. It wasn't. I don't think that was the common practice, and I believe that there's a good reason why people think that. So either way, wherever you want to place all of the blame, this story, it goes to show, like, God gave David all this stuff that would be forbidden to most people. And, it would be forbidden to a priest. If a priest wanted to serve God, he would not be able to have all these wives and all these things and whatever. He would not be able to go out into battle and do these things because that calling would preclude those privileges. But for David as the king, God gave him all the things that David wanted, and yet he chose to take a thing that was not his to take, that was not right for him to take. And I think that, for those who are attracted to people of the same sex, that desire is for them in the eyes of God the one thing that they cannot have, and what they do with that is their choice. Because there are godly men like Henry Nouwen, the priest who was open about his desire but chose to live a life of chastity. And there's also people that choose to live in heterosexual relationships because perhaps they have a healthy desire for family and they do not want a life of chastity, but their attraction is not for the person that would be the healthy choice for them. And I would say that the act of loving your spouse, how you act toward your spouse is a matter of godly behavior, regardless of your attraction to them, even if they are of the opposite gender, even if you were attracted to them at one point. That commitments come before feelings and attractions, and so I was thinking of this thing of this idea of gay marriage, and of course, what comes along with it is, that marriage and family was designed by God as the means of reproduction, and that God created marriage so that people would have families and they would have children. And now there is such a thing that there are gay married couples that have children. And where they get those children from is, there's many different things, different ways that happens. But here's the problem. When people try to justify abortion, they say that it's the mother's right to choose, and therefore, the mother has the choice there, and ultimately that choice that's always being defended is the ending of the life of the baby, and the baby is not born, so we can pretend that was a legitimate choice for the mother to make, and we ignore the rights of the child. But when a gay couple decides that they want to have children, they are they are providing the half of the necessary component in their seed, and then from somewhere they're procuring a female half of the equation in the egg. And I would say that ultimately, while there are ethical discussions that could certainly be had around the things such as sperm donation, egg donation. Ultimately, that is not a life on its own. The egg is not a life on its own. The sperm is not a life on its own. And so that is somebody giving something of themselves that is not a life. And, you could make an argument that they're free to do with that as they will. And perhaps it is a loving thing when people do it for barren couples and other things like that. But then, usually, it's in many of these circumstances, it's not the woman donating the egg that is bearing the child, but it's another woman altogether. And this woman is doing it for financial reasons. And we may say that that woman's not selling a baby because she doesn't have genetic claim to that baby. It's somebody else's DNA. She's just being provided for the service of her uterus. But the problem is that unlike an abortion, which does not result in a life, this operation does result in a child being born. And from the standpoint of a child, and I think that this is very apparent not only in the way things develop, but in the way that we have conceived of such things for all of history prior to the possibilities that we now have, and the way that the Bible speaks. The woman that bears the child is the child's mother. And that child is a person with his own rights, but he or she has been denied the right to have a relationship with his mother because he was desired to be adopted by a gay couple. And that woman, we can say that was her choice to do that, and she didn't have a legal claim maybe because it's not her DNA, but she did bear the child. And she consents, but if David was not excused for killing Uriah because it was the sword of an Ammonite that did it, and not his actual sword, then in what sense is a wealthy gay couple taking advantage of a woman who cannot afford to have her own child, or is not in a position to have any child, or for whom having her own child or keeping a child would be a financial liability, to have her use her body to produce a child for them? I mean, is that, how do we classify that? Is that a form of rape? If coercion from a king who, due to his position of power, leaves little room for a woman to refuse, if you're going to say that is tantamount to rape, then isn't what people like Dave Rubin are doing a form of rape, and Pete Buttigieg and others? And if not, then what is, by what justification are we making this? This idea of like a consent as the ultimate. Consent is a concept of you giving up your right to have any grievance about the consequences of an action before you take that action. And isn't that not an abusive thing in some ways? Because it's we talk about in other areas the idea of something like consent versus informed consent. And can you ever truly be informed about what it means to have a child in your body for 9 months and to experience the relationship that a mother has with her child, and in that regard, I would say the fact that it's that the woman doesn't share DNA, that's the nature of every child. No child has the same DNA as their mother. They share some usually with the birth mother, but or with the natural mother, but the woman's body is designed to nourish and care for a being that is other than itself. It's a separate person. It's a symbiotic relationship. And there's even evidence and research that that when the mother has problems in her body, the child is sharing stem cells and DNA to repair what's wrong with that mother's body. And I don't think that is any different whether the egg came from the woman bearing the child or not. If the child is growing and healthy, then all of the aspects of that relationship are intact. And so that child has a mother, and his mother gave birth to him, just as every child who has ever been born had a mother who gave birth to them, regardless of what their DNA is or who raises them. But a privileged group has found a way to deprive the children of the right to that relationship with that mother, without, and the child certainly can't understand or consent to that. Just as we say the child doesn't want to be murdered in a womb, a baby does not want to be taken away from its mother either. And there is not knowledge of what a child without a mother fully becomes. People are adaptive, and people make the best of things. And I have no doubt that children that are going to be raised by gay parents are going to be able to have good lives. But you're putting them in a position where, if it's a boy and he's attracted to women, how is he going to know? Like, what is his experience going to be? He's going to have no point of reference for how a man loves a woman. And if it's a girl, how's she going to know what it's like to see a woman being loved by a man? And some of these arguments have been around for a while. But if we as Christians will be opposed to human trafficking in the many forms that it comes in, I don't think that we could see this as any different of a form. And that's why I think it's something very it may be the time for us to start pushing on this button. And it's not about hating and being bigoted or anything like that, because there is a victim in this circumstance, and it is that infant who does not get to know his mother. And I'm not saying that all these technologies are necessarily evil, because what people design and create and work on for ill use, God has a way of redeeming. And so I'm not saying that banning all sorts of reproductive, medical procedures is necessarily the answer, but we have to be very careful about our affirmations about something being just as good as something else. And so I think that because, we more or less have had in the discussion between Dave Rubin and Jordan Peterson a sort of endorsement of this thing from their sides of the camp, maybe we need to assert the necessity of our presence in this sort of political endeavor that we're going on there. And if the conservatives want to get the conservative political things done that they want to get done, they can't do it without the Christians, unless if they are willing to, abandon it, or it becomes something other than what it is. And this dovetails up against the other criticisms that I've had, that even in regard to Jordan Peterson talking about the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue, they're not approaching that from the godly standpoint either, and I think Christians need to be more vocal about it. But we need to realize that we need to look at all of our alliances and figure out where we stand and where we agree and where we disagree. And if we can work with somebody that we disagree with, that's good. But we need to be free to hold to our disagreements and not be put down because of them. Or if we are put down, then that is the consequence of us suffering for the cause of Christ, and we have to be okay with that too. But we can't just be silent when evil occurs because it's a particularly friendly version of evil, or a seemingly not that bad kind of evil, or a politically advantageous form of evil. Because the truth is the truth, and any distortion of it or corruption of it ceases it to no longer be the truth. And we're not perfect, so we're not going to get everything right, but perfection is the thing that we strive for. So, that may be a little convoluted, I don't know, but those are some of my thoughts. And I don't think that the other concept of holding up all the other aspects of the ideal is wrong either. I think that is something that we should strive for. I think it's better to have gay marriage than it is to have, gay nightclubs. If I had to have a choice of having a gay married couple living next door, or living next door to a den of promiscuity, that's not a hard choice to make. It is the lesser of two evils. But the fact that something is the lesser of two evils should not blind us to the fact that it's still evil. And if it's a tent that we are walking through for a time to get us where we're going, that's okay. But it's not the way things that are going to be in the home that we build. And I'm sure there's lots of people that would take a lot of criticisms to things that I say. But I think that it's loving to say these things and to deny what seems evidently to be the truth for the sake of not harming people's feelings is actually the greater sin. So that is why I am talking about this today. So leave a comment. Thank you.